James had always been a quiet kid, the kind who could get lost in the pages of a book or the hum of an airplane engine. It was an ordinary morning at the airport, one that started just like any other. His mother, Samantha, had worked tirelessly to give her children a life filled with opportunities, even though being a single parent was far from easy. Today was special, though. Today they were flying out for their long-awaited vacation. Florida. Sun, beaches, and time to forget the daily grind. For James, it was also a chance to see the world from a different angle, something he'd been fascinated with ever since he could remember. He dreamt of flying planes someday, watching the world unfold from 30,000 feet. The family arrived at the bustling terminal early, eager to check in and get to the gate. Samantha kept a watchful eye on her children, ensuring everything was in order. Her younger daughter, Lily, was bouncing with excitement as they made their way to security. James, meanwhile, was a little more reserved, but his mind was on the flight, on the jet engines, the sky. As they waited in line for their boarding passes, James couldn't help but feel a sense of calm. It was an ordinary day, but for him, it was special. As they moved through security and reached the gate, the excitement continued to build. The flight was nearly ready for boarding, and the anticipation of the adventure ahead made James feel almost weightless. His eyes wandered toward the airplane at the gate, its sleek silver body gleaming under the bright terminal lights. But as they approached the boarding area, things started to feel off. The airline staff, who were busy handling boarding procedures, were visibly annoyed. One in particular, a woman named Martha, seemed particularly frazzled. She was hurrying back and forth, barking at passengers to get in line, and when she noticed James and his family, her expression soured. At first, James thought it was just a bad day for Martha, as everyone has them. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that she wasn't having a bad day. She was just annoyed by their presence. It wasn't blatant, but her body language spoke volumes. When James moved a little too slowly while adjusting his carry-on bag, Martha snapped at him, telling him to hurry up. It wasn't a normal interaction, not the way staff usually talk to passengers. But James, being the quiet and respectful child he was, simply nodded and moved on. Samantha, noticing the tension building, tried to brush it off. Maybe Martha was just under pressure, she thought. But as they stood waiting for their final call, it became worse. Martha seemed to take every opportunity to make a pointed comment. At one point, when James went to ask about the restroom location, Martha sharply told him to figure it out. The other passengers glanced over, some in confusion, others clearly uncomfortable with the way the situation was escalating. The moment that changed everything happened when the boarding process started. The line was moving smoothly, but when James approached the desk, Martha raised her voice, telling him he was standing too close to the gate agent, as though he had done something wrong. James, startled, took a step back, his heart racing. But then Martha leaned over the counter and made a cutting remark. "We don't have all day for you to figure things out." James didn't respond. He was trying to hold it together, but his nerves were getting the better of him. Samantha, who had been trying to keep a calm facade, now found herself struggling. She stepped forward, trying to diffuse the situation. "What's the problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "She's just been rude to my son," Samantha replied, her face flushed with frustration. Martha's attitude grew colder. She crossed her arms and shot Samantha a look that could freeze fire. "It's not my fault your kid's a troublemaker," she snapped, her voice dripping with disdain. Samantha was taken aback, but she stood her ground. "Excuse me, but that's uncalled for," she said, her voice steady despite the tension rising in the room. James, still not fully understanding the weight of the situation, felt his throat tighten. He wasn't a troublemaker. He had always been the kid who kept to himself, who never caused a fuss. Yet here he was, being publicly humiliated for no reason at all. It wasn't the first time he had faced racial prejudice, but today it was hitting harder than ever. His mother had always taught him to be strong in the face of adversity, but standing there, in front of a crowded terminal, was testing everything he believed in. The rest of the passengers began to take notice, some whispering to each other, others staring in uncomfortable silence. Samantha, determined not to back down, asked to speak with a supervisor. But as they waited, things only escalated. Martha, now visibly angry, leaned over the counter once again, making a snide remark to James, who stood frozen in place. "You really think you're going to get special treatment just because of who you're related to?" Samantha's heart sank. She could see where this was heading, and she wasn't going to let it get any worse. But before she could respond, something unexpected happened. A figure in a uniform walked up behind them. Captain Richards, the flight's pilot. James turned slowly, recognizing the man in front of him. The towering figure, with a calm and authoritative presence, looked down at James and then at the commotion unfolding. "I'm sorry," Captain Richards said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is there a problem here?" Martha's posture stiffened at the sound of his voice. She hadn't expected anyone to intervene, least of all a pilot. But before she could answer, Captain Richards turned to James, who stood awkwardly, still processing the situation. "James," Captain Richards asked, his tone softening slightly. It was then that the realization hit James like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just any pilot. This man was the father he'd always looked up to, the one he had admired from a distance. But there was something more to this moment, something James couldn't yet understand. The room fell silent as Captain Richards stepped forward, placing a protective hand on his son's shoulder. As Martha looked on, her face a mix of confusion and guilt, James realized that his ordinary day, one that began with so much excitement, had just been turned upside down. The atmosphere in the terminal shifted in an instant. The tension that had been slowly building throughout the confrontation now hung thick in the air, as if every passenger, every employee, was holding their breath, unsure of what would happen next. James, still trying to process everything, stood there with his heart pounding in his chest, his hand gripping the strap of his backpack. His mother, Samantha, had always warned him that life wasn't always fair, but she had never prepared him for something like this. She had never told him that he would be the target of such overt cruelty, especially not in front of so many people. Captain Richards, now standing next to his son, surveyed the scene with a level of calm that belied the storm brewing within him. The air had gone still, and as he looked at Martha, his eyes narrowed in quiet fury. There was a long, drawn-out silence before he finally spoke, his voice carrying through the terminal. "Is this how we treat passengers?" His words were measured but unmistakably firm. Martha, who had been bracing herself for any kind of retaliation, flinched at his tone. She hadn't expected this level of scrutiny, certainly not from a pilot, and especially not from someone who was now standing beside the very boy she had just humiliated. Martha, clearly rattled, opened her mouth, but no words came out. The pressure of the situation seemed to crush her, and for a moment, it felt like the entire terminal was holding its collective breath, waiting for the next move. Then, as if trying to regain control of the situation, Martha took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak. "This boy was causing a disturbance," she said, her voice wavering just slightly. "I had to maintain order." Samantha shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with disbelief. "Disturbance? He's a child. All he did was ask a simple question." She took a step closer to Captain Richards, who was still standing tall, his hand now resting protectively on James' shoulder. "She's been rude to him from the moment we arrived, for no reason at all." The other passengers, who had been quietly observing the situation, began to murmur amongst themselves. Some nodded in agreement with Samantha, while others looked uncomfortable, unsure of what to say or do. The truth was clear to everyone. What had happened was unjust. But it wasn't just the flight staff that was at fault. The entire system was broken, allowing this type of behavior to go unchallenged. James felt a strange mixture of emotions. There was anger, yes, but also a deep sense of humiliation. He had never imagined something like this could happen, especially not to him. In his mind, he had always been the quiet kid who kept to himself, who followed the rules, who did everything he could to avoid causing any problems. He wasn't one to stand out. Yet here he was, the center of a public spectacle, with everyone staring at him as if he were the one at fault. And then came the twist that James had not seen coming, the realization that Martha hadn't known who he was. That in itself was part of the reason she had treated him the way she had. If she had known, would she have acted differently? Would she have given him the same treatment if she had known that his father was Captain Richards, the very pilot of this flight? It was hard to say. Captain Richards stepped forward, his voice low but commanding. "My son is not just any passenger. He's my son, and I will not stand by and watch him be treated this way. Not by anyone, especially not by an airline employee." Samantha, still trying to keep her composure, turned to James, her face a mixture of pride and worry. She could see the hurt in his eyes, the sting of the humiliation. She had always told him to be strong, to rise above. But this was different. This was an attack on his character, and she wasn't about to let it slide. Martha, looking flustered and increasingly uncomfortable, took a step back. She had no words to offer in defense of her actions. She had seen the way Captain Richards' eyes had narrowed in anger, and she knew she was no longer in control of the situation. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable, and the other passengers, who had been passively watching, were now on the edge of their seats, waiting to see how things would unfold. Samantha took a deep breath and turned to the nearest gate attendant, asking to speak with someone in charge. "I want to speak to a supervisor." Now, her voice was calm but unwavering. The attendant, looking a little too eager to avoid further conflict, quickly disappeared behind the counter to get the manager. James, still standing there, felt as though the floor beneath him had shifted. His mind was racing. He had always imagined flying, sure, but never like this. Never under such circumstances. He hadn't wanted attention, didn't want anyone to make a fuss. But now, everything had changed. His mother was standing up for him. And Captain Richards, his father, was too. And while that gave him a sense of comfort, it also stirred something deeper inside him, something that was both foreign and empowering. He had never realized how much he needed this kind of support, this kind of defense. He had never felt this type of pride before. The supervisor arrived moments later, a middle-aged man with a well-practiced smile and a calm demeanor. "What seems to be the problem here?" he asked, his gaze flicking between Captain Richards and Martha, who was still standing off to the side, her face red with embarrassment. Samantha wasted no time. "My son was unfairly singled out and humiliated by your staff. We were treated like criminals for no reason other than the fact that Martha didn't like him asking questions." The supervisor glanced at Martha, then at Captain Richards, and finally at James. There was a pause, and it was clear that the situation was spiraling out of control. He didn't have the answers. No one did. This was no longer about an isolated incident. It was about something much larger. James felt the weight of the eyes on him, on all of them. For a moment, it felt like the world was watching, like the universe itself had slowed down, waiting for the next move. Would this moment change anything? Would it be swept under the rug, like so many other instances of injustice? Or would it be the turning point that forced everyone to reconsider how they treated one another, especially in situations like this? It was then, as the quiet tension built to a boiling point, that James realized the full magnitude of what had just transpired. This wasn't just about a flight staff member being rude to him. This was about a much bigger issue, an issue that he was now at the center of, whether he wanted to be or not. As the supervisor and airline staff huddled together, trying to make sense of the chaotic scene that had unfolded, James stood frozen, his mind racing. The sudden rush of realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. His father, Captain Richards, wasn't just any random passenger. He was the pilot of the very flight they were about to board. James had known he would one day grow up to be like his father, someone who flew planes and commanded respect. But this was different. In that moment, standing alongside his father in front of a disorganized and frazzled airline team, James felt an overwhelming wave of pride. Pride for his father, who had always been the rock of their family, a constant source of strength. But that pride was quickly mingled with a deep sense of anger. No one should be treated the way he had just been treated. Not by anyone. Especially not by someone who had so little regard for his dignity. As the manager began discussing the incident with Martha and the other airline employees, James tried to take it all in. He couldn't help but notice the way the other passengers looked at him. Some with sympathy, others with a sense of guilt, as if they'd all just witnessed something they'd prefer to forget. But no one had stepped in. Not one of them had done anything to stop the mistreatment when it was happening. That realization stung harder than anything else. Martha, who had remained silent since the confrontation, looked from the manager to James, her face pale and expressionless. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anyone to stand up to her, let alone a well-respected pilot like Captain Richards. The gravity of the situation was sinking in, and she realized that the incident could have far-reaching consequences for her career. Her fingers fidgeted nervously with the fabric of her uniform, and she took a step back, attempting to distance herself from the fallout. Captain Richards wasn't angry in the way most people might have expected. He wasn't shouting or making a scene. Instead, he stood calmly, his posture unshaken. He had always been the type to remain composed, no matter what the circumstances were, but his silence was more powerful than any outburst could have been. He wasn't going to let the situation slide. He couldn't. James was his son, and no one would ever make him feel inferior, especially not on an occasion that was meant to be filled with joy. The supervisor finally turned toward Captain Richards, acknowledging the weight of the situation. "Captain, I apologize for what happened here. This is certainly not how we want our passengers to feel, especially in this airport." His tone was placating, but James could tell it was more for the sake of saving face than anything else. The apology felt hollow, like an attempt to avoid public scrutiny, rather than a genuine expression of remorse. Captain Richards didn't immediately respond. Instead, he looked down at his son, his gaze softening. "I appreciate the apology," he said quietly, "but that's not enough. No apology can undo the damage done here. You've made my son feel small, and no one should ever have to experience that. No one." The supervisor's face flushed, and he nervously cleared his throat. "We'll certainly look into the matter, Captain. You have my word." But the response felt rehearsed, as though it was something he had said too many times before in similar situations. Samantha, who had been standing at her son's side, her hand gently resting on his arm, now stepped forward, her voice firm but controlled. "It's not just about an apology," she said, her eyes locked on the supervisor. "It's about respect. For James. For every person who steps foot on this plane. What happened today wasn't just a mistake. It was an example of the deep-rooted problems within this system." There was a moment of silence as everyone processed Samantha's words. The air felt thick, as though something had shifted in the room. James could feel the tension in his chest, the frustration building up inside him. But there was something else too. Something that felt almost like a strange kind of relief. His mother and father were both fighting for him in ways he had never seen before. They weren't backing down. And neither was he. For the first time in his life, he realized just how much power he had to shape his own narrative. As the manager began making apologies once again, Captain Richards turned to James, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly. James, still trying to process everything, nodded, though he didn't feel okay. He felt like his world had been flipped upside down. He felt humiliated, exposed, but also something else, something deeper. His father's presence, his calm strength, reminded him that he didn't have to fight these battles alone. For so long, James had been someone who kept his head down, someone who tried to avoid confrontation. He had always believed that if he was just quiet enough, If he was just respectful enough, the world would be kind to him. But now, in the aftermath of this incident, James understood something far more valuable. Sometimes, you have to stand up, even when you're scared, even when it seems like you're the only one willing to do so. The manager, now clearly anxious, motioned for one of the flight attendants to escort them to their seats, assuring them that the issue would be resolved quickly. But as James began walking towards the gate with his family, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was happening, something that would ripple through the community, and maybe even the airline industry, for years to come. And then, as they passed through the gate, James overheard a whispered conversation between two of the passengers who had witnessed the incident. "Did you hear? That kid is the pilot's son," one of them said. "No wonder the captain stepped in. I guess some people don't get it until it's too late." James stopped in his tracks, hearing the words that would forever change how he saw everything. He was more than just a quiet kid traveling with his family. He was the son of someone important, someone who could make a difference. It wasn't the identity he had ever wanted to flaunt. But in that moment, it felt like his family's legacy had just become the key to something much larger than himself. The rest of the boarding process was uneventful, but James couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. The ordeal wasn't over, not by a long shot. It was just beginning. The questions started to swirl in his mind. What would happen next? What would the airline do? And more importantly, what would the community think about all of this? Would they stand by, silent and complicit, or would they rise up and demand justice? As the plane finally began to taxi down the runway, James looked out the window, his mind swirling with thoughts. He had thought this vacation would be the highlight of his year. Instead, it had become the turning point of his life. The flight had barely taken off, but James felt as if his world had already been irrevocably changed. The days that followed the incident seemed to stretch on forever, and the weight of what had happened at the airport hung over James like a dark cloud. The flight had taken off without further drama, but the sense of unease didn't dissipate once they reached their destination. Florida's warm beaches, which should have been a welcome escape, felt distant and foreign, almost irrelevant in the face of what had transpired. As they settled into their hotel, the media storm began to pick up. Local news stations reported on the incident, and soon it spread far beyond the confines of the small airport. People from across the country began discussing the treatment of James, the pilot's son, and the way the airline had handled the situation. Some of the headlines called it a racial incident, while others dubbed it a public confrontation. What seemed to be a small act of prejudice had now escalated into a full-blown controversy, one that no one, least of all James and his family, had expected. At first, the attention felt overwhelming. James had never been in the public eye before. He had never wanted to be. He had always been content living in the background, where he could quietly admire the planes, read about aviation, and dream of flying. But now he was forced into the spotlight. The media seized on every detail, speculating about his father's reaction, asking whether the pilot would take legal action, and probing into the broader social implications of the incident. James saw himself on the news, his face plastered across screens in living rooms across the nation. But it wasn't just the public eye that concerned him. It was the quiet whispers he heard in the hallways at school when he returned home. His classmates didn't know how to react. Some offered sympathy, while others looked at him like he was somehow different, like the attention he had received made him untouchable, or worse, a target. His friends were unsure of how to act around him, unsure of what to say. His teacher pulled him aside one afternoon and asked if he was okay. But even her concern seemed hollow, as if she too was unsure how to navigate the sudden shift in their relationship. "You're a brave boy," she said, attempting to offer words of comfort. But James wasn't sure he felt brave. He didn't feel proud. He felt exposed, like his personal life had been ripped open for everyone to see. It was one thing to be the quiet kid at school. It was another thing entirely to have your name splashed across the news for something you had no control over. At home, The tension between his parents was palpable. Samantha had always been fiercely protective of her children, but she wasn't used to this level of scrutiny. She had spent her life raising James and Lily with the belief that their worth came from who they were as people, not from their last name or their family connections. But now, she found herself questioning everything. She was proud of her husband's actions, of the way Captain Richards had stood up for their son. But she also felt a deep sense of unease. The incident had stirred something deep within her, something she hadn't anticipated. She had always been prepared to fight for her children's rights, but the world had a way of complicating things, of turning moments of clarity into complex moral dilemmas. Was standing up for James enough? Or was it time to take a different kind of stand, one that demanded real change? Captain Richards, on the other hand, was consumed by a growing sense of frustration. He had never intended for his family to be in the spotlight. His career had been built on professionalism, on being the calm in the storm, but now that calm had been shattered. He had spent decades in the cockpit, learning to control the chaos of the skies, but this was a different kind of turbulence, a personal one. His initial reaction had been to protect his son, and he had done so without hesitation. But now, as the media continued to swirl around them, he couldn't help but wonder whether he had made the right choice. Could he have handled it differently? Should he have ignored the incident, let it go, and moved on with their lives? Or had he done the right thing by standing up, by refusing to let his son be treated like that in front of everyone? As the days passed, the fallout from the incident became impossible to ignore. The airline, under increasing pressure, issued a statement apologizing for Martha's actions, but it felt like an empty gesture. The apology seemed less like a true expression of remorse and more like a damage control tactic. The airline promised to review its policies to ensure that such an incident would never happen again, but the public was skeptical. There were calls for Martha's resignation, for accountability at the highest levels of the airline's leadership, but the company was hesitant to take any drastic action. The situation had already spiraled out of their control, and they feared that taking a stand against one employee might open a floodgate of legal issues. As the days turned into weeks, the scrutiny only grew. News outlets began airing follow-up stories, asking what had been done to address the issue, and what steps the airline would take to ensure it never happened again. The pressure mounted, and Captain Richards found himself being pulled into meetings with company executives, trying to navigate a delicate balance between standing up for his family and protecting his own career. Meanwhile, James' school continued to react in its own way. Some teachers reached out, offering support, while others struggled to understand what to say. His friends seemed uncertain, some rallying around him, while others drifted away, unsure of how to react to the unwanted attention. One afternoon, during a particularly tense moment in the schoolyard, James overheard a conversation between two boys. "Did you hear? That kid is the pilot's son. His dad is a big deal," one of the boys said, his voice tinged with jealousy. The other responded with a snicker. "Yeah, but he doesn't seem that special. What's the big deal about a pilot anyway?" James felt a wave of discomfort wash over him. It wasn't just the fact that they were talking about him. It was the way they talked about his father, like Captain Richards was somehow just another man in a uniform, someone who had no more significance than anyone else. But to James, his father was everything. He wasn't just a pilot. He was a protector, a hero. And in that moment, James realized something that had been nagging at him for days. The world didn't always see things the way he did. It didn't always value the things that mattered most. His father's actions, the courage it took to stand up for him in front of the airline staff, were being overshadowed by the sensationalism of the incident. The world was more focused on the drama, on the conflict, than on the reasons behind it. As James lay in bed that night, his thoughts spinning, he understood one thing with newfound clarity. The world was never going to change unless people made it change. It wasn't enough to sit back and hope for better treatment. It wasn't enough to wait for the system to fix itself. If they wanted real change, real justice, They would have to make their voices heard. And in that moment, as the weight of it all settled in, James realized that his family's story was just the beginning. The world might not be ready for what was about to come, but they would have to face it, whether they wanted to or not. The true fallout from that fateful day at the airport had only just begun. Weeks passed, and the story continued to unfold in ways James never could have predicted. His family had become the focal point of a larger conversation, a conversation that stretched beyond the confines of their town or even the nation. It became a cultural debate, an issue that spurred heated discussions about race, privilege, and the treatment of people, especially in spaces that were supposed to be neutral and welcoming. What had started as an isolated incident in an airport had ballooned into a public reckoning. For James, it felt surreal. Every morning, he woke up to news stories about his family, his father's resignation from the airline, and the fallout from the public confrontation. What had once been an embarrassing and painful moment was now the subject of debate on television, in newspapers, and online forums. James' name had become synonymous with injustice, and though that brought with it an odd sense of pride, it also made him feel incredibly vulnerable. People were talking about him, his family, his father's career, and the decision they had made to take a stand. But what was the real cost of all this attention? Captain Richards, though proud of the courage he had shown, was no stranger to the pressure that came with being in the public eye. His resignation from the airline, which had once seemed like the right thing to do, was now starting to feel like a sacrifice, one that would have ramifications he hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just his career that was on the line. His entire identity as a pilot, as a respected member of the community, had been called into question. The airline's attempt at reconciliation had done little to repair the damage. They had offered him a severance package, a small consolation prize for the inconvenience of being in the public eye. But Captain Richards wasn't interested in being compensated for his dignity. He wanted change, and that meant forcing the airline to confront the systemic issues that led to the treatment of his son. But as the weeks wore on, he began to feel the weight of his decision. The community had been split. There were those who praised him for standing up, those who saw his actions as a necessary fight for justice. But there were also those who criticized him, saying he had overreacted, that his son's treatment wasn't enough to warrant a resignation. He had become a symbol, and not everyone saw him as a hero. Samantha, on the other hand, had become increasingly resolute in her conviction that they had done the right thing. She had spent years teaching her children to stand up for what was right, to be the kind of people who would not sit idly by when faced with injustice. And though she had been unsettled by the backlash, she remained unwavering in her belief that this was bigger than just their family. This was about the larger picture, about making sure that no one else would be treated the way James had been. But even she began to feel the weight of the public scrutiny. Their quiet, ordinary lives had been thrown into disarray, and the cost of their stand was becoming clearer with every passing day. The phone calls, the interviews, the constant attention, it was exhausting. And yet she kept pushing forward, driven by a sense of justice, by the thought that maybe, just maybe, this would make a difference in the world. But as the media frenzy continued, she couldn't help but wonder if it was worth it. Would the world truly change because of their actions, or would it simply fade into the background like so many other stories of injustice before it? James was tired of it all. Tired of hearing his name on the news, tired of the constant reminders of what had happened, tired of the questions he had to answer at school, at home, and everywhere in between. What he wanted more than anything was to be left alone, to go back to being the kid who read about airplanes, who dreamed of becoming a pilot, who could simply exist without being the subject of every conversation. But he knew that wasn't possible anymore. The world had changed around him, and he had no choice but to change with it. One afternoon, as the media attention reached a fever pitch, Captain Richards sat James down in the living room. "Son," he began, his voice softer than usual, "I know this has been hard on you, harder than I ever imagined. But I want you to understand something. What we're going through, what you're going through, it's important. And sometimes, when you take a stand, when you speak out, there's a cost. But there's also a chance to make things better, to make things right. James listened, though he wasn't sure he fully understood. He had seen the impact of his father's decision on their lives, on his own life, but he had never really grasped how much it could ripple outward, how much one act of courage could spark conversations, could change minds. But what was the point of it all if it only brought more pain? If standing up for what was right came at the expense of his own peace, his own sense of normalcy? Was it worth it? The question lingered in his mind for days, gnawing at him as the debates continued to rage in the media. And then, in the middle of all the chaos, something happened. A series of interviews surfaced in which Martha, the flight attendant who had sparked the entire incident, publicly apologized for her actions. She admitted to her wrongdoing, acknowledging that her treatment of James had been influenced by biases she had not even recognized in herself. She spoke of the impact of her actions on James and his family, of how her own life had been irrevocably altered by the events that had unfolded. She expressed remorse, and her words resonated with many, sparking a conversation not only about the mistreatment of one boy, but about the prejudices that existed within the airline industry and beyond. The story didn't end with her apology. It continued to grow, to evolve. The airline, pressured by public opinion, began to overhaul its training programs, focusing on cultural competency and anti-bias education for all its staff. James and his family had started something bigger than just themselves. They had forced an institution to confront its shortcomings, and in doing so, they had brought about change. But the journey was far from over. The conversation had only just begun. As the dust began to settle, James realized something. Maybe he hadn't wanted all of this. Maybe he hadn't wanted the attention, the media, the public outcry. But now, looking back, he understood that sometimes the price of doing the right thing wasn't peace or normalcy. It was sacrifice. And though it had cost him more than he had expected, it had also given him something invaluable. A sense of purpose, a sense of belonging in a world that was slowly waking up to the need for change. Samantha, watching her son grow and mature through this trial, saw the transformation within him. He wasn't the same boy who had boarded that flight months ago. He was stronger, more aware, more willing to speak out when it mattered. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to feel a sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this would lead to something bigger than any of them had imagined. Maybe this was the beginning of something that would change the world for the better. And in that moment, she knew it was all worth it. The fallout had been hard, but the lesson was clear. Change didn't come without cost. And sometimes, you had to risk everything to make a difference. As months passed, the ripple effect of the incident at the airport slowly began to fade from the headlines, but it continued to linger in the lives of those most affected. The airline had implemented its new training programs, and a few changes had been made to its policies. But the question remained, had it truly learned from its mistakes, or was it simply trying to restore its image? For James, the transformation that had taken place within him over the course of this journey was profound. He had gone from being a quiet, introspective child, content to stay in the background, to someone who understood the power of his voice and his story. But the cost of this transformation hadn't been without its challenges. At school, things had changed. Some classmates still treated him as though he were a curiosity, while others seemed to distance themselves, unsure of how to react to the attention he had received. James had learned the hard way that standing up for what was right often made you a target, but he also realized that sometimes doing the right thing was more important than being accepted. It wasn't about fitting in anymore. It was about being true to who he was and what he believed in, even when it wasn't easy. Samantha had watched her son grow stronger throughout this ordeal, but she had also been deeply affected by the way the community had responded. There were those who had supported them, who had recognized the importance of standing up for their family and the values they had fought for. But there were also those who saw their actions as an overreaction, who believed that the attention they received was excessive and unwarranted. For Samantha, it was a harsh reminder of how divided the world still was. The divisions were not just between races or classes. They ran deeper, cutting across every facet of society. But despite the resistance they faced, Samantha knew that they had done something important. The changes that had begun to take shape in the airline, the conversations that had started to spark about bias and injustice, were proof that their fight had not been in vain. And for that, she felt a deep sense of pride. Captain Richards, on the other hand, had faced his own set of challenges in the months following his resignation. He had been offered opportunities to return to the aviation industry, but he found that he couldn't go back to the life he had once known. The world had changed for him. His resignation, though painful, had been the right decision. But it had also left him questioning where he fit in now. He wasn't just the captain of a plane. He was a symbol of something much larger, a symbol of someone who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. And while he was proud of the stand he had taken, the aftermath had been complicated. The weight of his decision, of leaving behind a career he had worked so hard to build, had not been easy to bear. But every time he saw the strength in his son's eyes, every time he remembered the pride he had felt standing beside him in that airport, he knew it had been worth it. The world might have tried to tear them down, but they had risen above, and in doing so, they had sparked something much bigger than themselves. It wasn't just the airline that had been forced to confront its biases. Over time, people across the country began to reflect on their own behavior, their own treatment of others, especially in situations that they may have overlooked or dismissed in the past. James' story became a symbol for many, an example of how one voice, one family, could challenge the status quo and bring about real change. His name, once whispered in hushed tones at school, began to be spoken with respect. He wasn't just the boy who had been humiliated at the airport. He was the boy who had stood up, who had demanded better for himself and for others. He was the boy who had changed things. Yet, despite the positive shifts that had occurred, James still wrestled with the impact of what had happened. He understood now, more than ever, that fighting for justice often came with a heavy price. It wasn't just about being in the right. It was about the emotional toll it took, the way it disrupted your life, the way it made you question the world around you. And as much as he had learned, as much as he had grown, there was still a part of him that longed for the quiet, peaceful life he had once known. He wanted to go back to his books, to his dreams of flying, without the weight of the world on his shoulders. But deep down, he knew that would never be possible again. One evening, as James sat by the window, looking out at the world he now saw so differently, his father came to sit beside him. There was a quiet understanding between them now, a bond forged in the fire of the trials they had faced together. "I know this hasn't been easy," Captain Richards said, his voice low, filled with an emotion James had never heard in him before. "But I want you to know something. You're stronger than I ever thought you could be. What you did, what we did, it mattered. And I'm proud of you, son. I'm proud of how you've handled everything, even when it seemed like the world was against you." James looked at his father, his heart swelling with pride, but also with the weight of everything they had been through. "I didn't ask for any of this, Dad," he said quietly. "I just wanted things to be normal, to not be different." "I know," Captain Richards replied. "But sometimes being different is the very thing that makes you stand out. Sometimes it's what changes the world." The weight of his father's words settled in James' heart. He had never wanted to be in the spotlight. He had never sought to be a symbol of change. But now, looking back, he understood that what had happened was bigger than him. It was bigger than his family. It was about something much more important, something that would shape the world for generations to come. And as difficult as it had been, as much as he had been forced to grow and change in ways he hadn't wanted, he understood now that this was the path he had to walk. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place when James was invited to speak at a local community event, a gathering organized by an advocacy group that had been inspired by his family's actions. As he stood before a room full of strangers, he realized just how far they had come. The community that had once been divided over his family's decision was now united in its desire to create a better, more just world. And in that moment, as he spoke about the importance of standing up for what was right, of using your voice to make a difference, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. The journey had been long, and it had been hard. But James knew now that it was worth it. Because in the end, they hadn't just changed their own lives, they had changed the lives of countless others. And though the road ahead would still be difficult, James understood that it was a road they would walk together, as a family, as a community, and as individuals who had learned the true power of standing up for what was right. The journey was just beginning, and James was ready to face it, stronger than ever before.